It was a stormy evening. The kind where rain swept the streets clean of life, leaving only the dim glow of streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. Ava Bennett, a young black girl of 16, walked carefully through the drizzle. Her white recital dress, damp at the hem, billowed slightly with every step. In her arms, she cradled her recital program and sheet music, the fragile symbols of a night that was meant to mark a triumph. Her first solo performance at Madison Concert Hall. Her braids, intricately styled by her father that morning, clung to her shoulders, heavy with rain but still pristine. Officer Ethan Price sat slouched in his patrol car nearby, 12 hours into his shift. Exhaustion had turned his vigilance into suspicion, the kind that simmered quietly beneath the surface. When he saw Ava, a girl in a spotless white dress, walking alone in a neighborhood he decided she didn't belong, in his mind snapped to attention. What's someone like her doing out here? The question wasn't whispered with curiosity. It was thought with assumption. The patrol car's headlights cut through the rain, its engine humming low as Price pulled up alongside her. "Stop right there." His voice, sharp and accusing, sliced through the stillness of the street. Ava paused mid-step, startled, her fingers instinctively clutching her bag tighter. "Where are you coming from?" Price demanded, stepping out of the car and slamming the door shut behind him. "I am walking home from my piano recital, sir," Ava replied, her voice clear but wavering. "I live just 3 blocks away." "ID. Now." She hesitated. "May I ask why, sir?" "I haven't done anything." "Empty the bag," he interrupted, the edge in his tone making it clear there would be no discussion. "Please," Ava protested softly. "My music, it'll be ruined in the rain." The request, so reasonable, seemed to offend him. "You're not cooperating. What's in that bag?" His eyes narrowed on her braids, his mouth twisting as suspicion deepened into unfounded certainty. "Those braids? Are you with a gang? You look like trouble to me." Ava flinched, the accusation like a slap. "They're just my hair," she said quietly. "You're obstructing," Price snapped, his hand already reaching for her arm. When she instinctively pulled back, Price's patience snapped. Within seconds, the cold bite of handcuffs tightened around her wrists, the metallic clink of authority echoing louder than it should have. The recital program, the sheet music, everything Ava had worked for spilled from her bag and floated like forgotten dreams into the puddles. By the time they reached the station, the humiliation had only begun. Ava sat silent on the cold metal bench of the holding cell, her white dress stained and wrinkled, her hair dripping into her lap. The room buzzed with fluorescent light, its harshness casting shadows across the space. Officer Price stood outside the cell, watching her, waiting for tears, for anger, for her to crumble. But Ava, her dignity still intact despite the weight of her shame, refused to give him that satisfaction. "Protocol," Price said coldly as he summoned a barber, a reluctant man whose hands shook as he glanced at Ava's composed but tear-brimmed eyes. "Sir, this doesn't seem necessary." The barber stammered, looking to Price for reason. "Do it," Price ordered, his voice ironclad, his certainty unwavering. Snip. The first braid fell, landing soundlessly in Ava's lap. The barber's scissors moved hesitantly, each cut breaking through the stillness like a gunshot. One by one, the braids fell, intricate and beautiful. Now stripped from her, Ava sat frozen in the chair, her reflection staring back at her from a dirty wall mirror. Her tears never fell, not until the final lock hit the floor. She gathered them in her lap like something sacred, like pieces of herself that couldn't be replaced. It wasn't just hair. It was love, hours of her father's hands weaving through her roots that morning. It was history, the tradition of a culture that had withstood generations of struggle. Officer Price turned to leave, his face betraying no emotion. And then the door opened. Captain Monroe stepped in, his expression darkening as his gaze landed on Ava, her butchered hair, the fallen braids, the silent tears in her eyes. The captain's voice, sharp with restrained fury, cut through the room. "What the hell happened here?" The question didn't need an answer. The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, beneath the hum of the fluorescent lights, a silent truth emerged, one that Price himself couldn't yet see. He hadn't just cut a girl's hair. He had carved a wound into the fabric of justice itself. And Ava, through her silence, her dignity unshaken, made the whole room feel its weight. The silence in Captain Monroe's office thickened. the weight of it settling like concrete. Outside the glass window, the precinct buzzed with activity phones rang. Keyboards clattered. Officers moved with a sense of purpose. But here, behind the closed door, Officer Ethan Price was trapped under the full force of Monroe's fury. "You don't get it, do you?" Monroe's voice was low now. Restrained, but all the more dangerous for it. 3 years. Daniel Bennett has been embedded for 3 years in Grayson's operation. One slip, one loose thread, and the whole thing unravels. And you, Officer Price, just yanked on that thread. Price's face paled. His mind scrambled for a defense. For anything that could justify what he had done. "Sir, I was following protocol." She was incooperative. Monroe's hand shot up, cutting him off. Don't insult me with excuses. That girl wasn't a suspect. She wasn't dangerous. She was walking home from a piano recital in her Sunday best. But you couldn't see past her braids. Past her skin. The words struck like blows. Each one sharp and unyielding. Monroe rose from his chair, pacing the room like a man who couldn't stand still for fear of exploding. "What the hell were you thinking, Ethan? You arrested a federal agent's daughter on a baseless suspicion and butchered her dignity in the process. Do you know what you've set in motion? Do you understand the consequences?" Price's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists on his lap. Shame burned hot in his chest. But still, his defenses bristled. "I didn't know who she was," he muttered. "I didn't." Monroe whirled to face him. "That's the damn problem, Price. You didn't know. And you didn't think. You acted on assumptions and your so-called instincts. And now, we're staring down the barrel of a disaster." He paused, hands on his hips, drawing in a sharp breath to steady himself. "Daniel Bennett is on his way here. Here, Price. And when he walks through that door, I don't want to see you utter a single word. You're going to sit there. Shut your mouth. And listen. Because when a man like Bennett speaks, we listen." The room felt colder. The hum of the precinct beyond the walls sounded suddenly far away. Price swallowed hard, his pride wrestling with the sinking realization that Monroe was right. He had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Moments later, the sound of approaching footsteps, calm, deliberate, unwavering, echoed down the hallway. Captain Monroe straightened, his face carved into stone. The door opened, and Daniel Bennett stepped in. The air shifted with his presence. Bennett was a man whose authority wasn't declared with words or rank but carried in his silence. In the steadiness of his gaze, he was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, and yet there was nothing soft or indulgent about him. He looked like a man forged in fire. A man who had spent years learning how to navigate dangerous places without losing his center. His eyes locked onto Price, immediately calm, but burning with something deeper. Price felt pinned to the chair, his mouth dry, unable to look away. "Captain Monroe," Bennett said, his voice measured. "Thank you for bringing me in." Monroe gave a curt nod. "I'll leave you two to talk." "No," Bennett said quietly, his gaze never leaving Price. "You stay." Monroe froze mid-step, then nodded again, stepping back into his corner of the room. Bennett slowly moved to the chair across from Price and sat down. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. When he spoke, Bennett's voice was low, steady as scalpel, not a hammer. "Do you have any idea what you did?" Price opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His throat felt like it had closed shut. Bennett leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "My daughter is 16 years old. A child. She spent weeks practicing for that recital. She worked hours on her hair, that morning, hours she should have been spending as any other teenager does. But instead, she stood in your holding cell as you had a barber cut away pieces of her identity." His voice didn't rise, but the sharp edges of it cut deeper than shouting ever could. "And why? Because she was walking alone in a dress too clean for the neighborhood? Because her braids didn't sit right with you? Because you saw what you wanted to see?" Price looked away, shame knotting in his chest. "I've spent 3 years of my life infiltrating one of the most dangerous criminal organizations on the East Coast." Bennett continued, his tone darker now. 3 years of carefully building trust. Walking the knife's edge every day. And you, with your reckless arrogance, nearly destroyed all of it. A few more whispers, a few more leaks, and Grayson's network would know exactly who I am and where to find my family." Price's head shot up, the words landing like a gut punch. "Where to find my family?" That's what you don't understand. Bennett said softly. Your mistake wasn't just an incident, Officer Price. It was a domino, a single, careless push that could have toppled an entire house of cards. For the first time, Price saw it, the bigger picture. The invisible consequences of his actions stretching out into the lives of people he'd never see or know. It was as if the ground beneath him had cracked wide open, revealing just how small and misguided his perspective had been. I'm not here for apologies, Bennett said, rising to his feet. I don't care what excuses you've told yourself. What I care about is fixing what's been broken and making sure this doesn't happen again. He turned to Monroe. I trust you'll handle your officer, Captain. Monroe nodded stiffly. Without another word, Bennett left the room, his footsteps echoing in the hallway until they disappeared. The silence that followed was deafening. Price sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the desk, his pulse thundering in his ears. Captain Monroe sighed heavily, breaking the silence. You'd better start asking yourself some hard questions, Price, because whatever you thought you were protecting out there, it's not worth this. Monroe didn't wait for a response. He grabbed the manila folder and left Price alone, the door clicking shut behind him. Price sat there in the dim room, the ticking clock suddenly louder than ever, counting the seconds he couldn't take back. The precinct break room was empty, save for the steady hum of an aging refrigerator and the faint smell of burned coffee lingering in the air. Officer Ethan Price sat at the corner table, his hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup, his thoughts far from the room around him. Outside, the buzz of the precinct continued unabated, reports filed, calls taken, lives unfolding, but for Price, time felt frozen. Bennett's words haunted him. Your mistake wasn't just an incident, it was a domino. They echoed in his mind like a cruel refrain, stripping away the flimsy justifications he had clung to for so long. Each replay of the scene, Ava's unwavering composure in the face of humiliation. The pile of fallen braids in her lap gnawed at him. The guilt was suffocating, but it wasn't enough. Guilt alone wouldn't fix what he had done. You look like you've seen a ghost. A voice cut through the silence. Price glanced up to see Captain Monroe leaning against the doorway, a steaming cup of fresh coffee in his hand. His expression was hard to read, a mixture of scrutiny and reluctant patience. You've been in here for an hour. Price, what's going on? Price didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared down at the scratches etched into the table's surface, years of careless hands leaving their mark. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. Captain, how do you fix something like this? Monroe raised an eyebrow. Fix what? You know what? Price's jaw clenched, his voice barely audible. How do you come back from crossing a line like that? Monroe studied him for a long moment, his expression softening just slightly. The first thing you do is stop trying to defend it. Stop looking for a way out. Then you roll up your sleeves and start doing the hard work, because that's all there is. Price. Hard, messy work. Price exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair. Bennett doesn't trust me. Hell, I don't trust me. Monroe took a sip of his coffee. He doesn't need to trust you. He needs you to act. Bennett's trying to dismantle an empire, and you're the one who almost brought it crashing down. Redemption isn't free, Price. You're going to have to earn it. The word earn hit Price like a weight. He had spent his career thinking he was in control, the one who enforced the rules. But now, sitting at the bottom of his own wreckage, he realized how powerless he was to change what had already been done. Bennett's giving you a way back, Monroe continued, his tone firm but not unkind. He didn't have to. You think you're the only cop who's made mistakes? You think you're the first man who's let his biases make the call? Price looked up sharply, ashamed but desperate to hear more. Monroe's voice dropped lower. This job has a way of twisting people. The streets get in your head, and suddenly, everyone fits a mold you didn't even know you carried. You think you're being careful. You think you're keeping the city safe. But all you're doing is poisoning the well, Price. And sooner or later, it catches up to you. The silence that followed was heavy. Price ran a hand over his face. Exhausted. What's Bennett want me to do? Monroe's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. What he wants is simple. What it requires from you is anything but. That evening, Price found himself parked outside a nondescript, abandoned warehouse. The dim glow of a street lamp lit the cracked pavement, casting long shadows that made the place feel colder than it already was. Price's grip tightened around the steering wheel as he replayed the last conversation with Daniel Bennett. "You're going to fix this," Bennett had said, his voice calm but unyielding. "You compromised my daughter's safety. You compromised this operation. Now, you're going to make yourself useful." Price had bristled at first. It wasn't just the words, it was the way Bennett had looked at him. Like a man seeing someone who wasn't worth saving. And maybe that was true. Maybe Price didn't deserve redemption. But that didn't mean he wasn't going to try. Now, in the near silence of the empty lot, his police radio sat dark and lifeless on the passenger seat. He wasn't here as an officer tonight. He wasn't wearing the badge that once felt like his shield. He was here as something else, someone trying to repair what he had broken. He stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting him like a slap. Across the lot, a black SUV idled, its exhaust rising into the night like a quiet signal. Mason Steele emerged first. Price's heart skipped a beat at the sight of Grayson's right-hand man, a towering figure with sharp, wolf-like eyes and the demeanor of a predator. Mason's expression was as unreadable as ever. "You're late," Mason said, his voice carrying a chill that matched the air. Price swallowed his nerves. "Traffic." Mason didn't smile. Instead, he handed Price a manila envelope thick and weighty in his hands. "We're watching you, Officer Price," Mason said. The last word spat like a slur. "Don't screw this up." Price nodded, saying nothing. He knew that any misstep would unravel more than just his fragile standing, it could cost lives. As the SUV pulled away, Price climbed back into his car, setting the envelope on the seat next to him. His hands trembled as he reached for his burner phone. He dialed a number and waited. Daniel Bennett's voice came through the line after the first ring. "Go ahead. They've given me something. I'll meet you in the usual place," Price said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "Understood," Bennett replied before the line went dead. Price placed the phone back on the seat and stared at the envelope. Its contents still unknown. He could feel the weight of the choice before him. There was no turning back now. He had thrown himself into dangerous waters, surrounded by predators who would tear him apart at the first sign of doubt. For the first time in his career, Price understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than himself. Later that night, in a quiet, empty safe house, Price slid the envelope across the table to Bennett. The federal agent opened it carefully, revealing a series of detailed shipment schedules, financial statements, and names, information that could cripple Grayson's network. Bennett looked up, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied Price. "You understand what you're in now, don't you?" Price nodded. "Yeah. If you waver, if you hesitate even once, Mason will see it. He's watching you closer than anyone." Bennett's voice was low but firm. "But if you stay the course, this will be your way out." Price held Bennett's gaze for a long moment. The man's words carried no sympathy, no comfort, only the truth. It wasn't trust or forgiveness Bennett was offering, it was a chance. A chance to start over. And Price knew, deep down, that it was more than he deserved. "I won't waver," he said quietly, the words more to himself than anyone else. Bennett leaned back, finally nodding. "Then let's get to work." As Price sat in the dim room, surrounded by maps, files, and voices plotting Grayson's downfall, a strange sense of clarity settled over him. He had been forced to see himself for who he really was, a man who had let his power blind him. A man who had caused harm where he thought he was bringing order. But now, for the first time in a long time, Ethan Price wasn't running from the truth. He was walking straight into it. The old upright piano sat in the corner of the Madison Community Music Center, its ivory keys worn and chipped from years of use. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, streaking the dusty wooden floor with warm golden light. Ava Bennett sat at the piano bench, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. Around her, a quiet hush settled, broken only by the soft breathing of a half-dozen children sitting cross-legged on the floor. They watched her intently, their young eyes reflecting admiration and curiosity. Ava inhaled deeply, steadying herself. It was a small room, far removed from the grand stages of concert halls or the humiliating walls of the police station where her braids had been taken from her. Yet in this space, she found something she hadn't felt in weeks: control. The chaos of her life fell away here, leaving nothing but her music and the story it would tell. "Close your eyes," she told the children, her voice soft yet strong. "Listen carefully and let the music take you somewhere." She pressed down the first note, a deep, somber sound that resonated like a slow breath. The piece began tentatively, the chords simple and delicate, like footsteps on uncertain ground. As the melody grew, it carried a quiet strength. Each note reflected her journey, the ache of humiliation, the weight of her stolen dignity, and the spark of resolve she refused to let die. The children sat motionless, their eyes shut tight, as the music swept through the room. It wasn't just beautiful, it was raw, honest. Every rise and fall of the notes told them something Ava couldn't put into words. Behind them, Daniel Bennett stood quietly in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't interrupt, he didn't dare. Instead, he listened as his daughter poured everything she'd endured into those keys. Ava's short braids, now growing back, slowly framed her face as she swayed with the music. For Daniel, it was as though the notes stitched together every wound the world had tried to inflict on her. The piano didn't just amplify her pain, it transformed it into resilience. The music reached its climax, soaring with a powerful intensity that seemed far too vast for such a small room. Then, with a trembling hush, it faded away. The final note hung in the air like a whisper, lingering as if unwilling to let go. Ava's fingers stilled, and for a moment, there was silence. Then one of the children, Lila, a shy girl with braids of her own, breathed out, "That was beautiful." Ava smiled faintly, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Music has a way of taking pain and turning it into something else. Something that can heal. "Did it hurt?" Lila asked quietly, her gaze lingering on Ava's short, uneven braids. "When they cut your hair?" Ava's chest tightened, but her expression remained calm. "It did," she admitted honestly, her voice steady, "not just because of the hair, but because of what it meant. My braids were something my father and I worked on together. They were a part of me. Losing them felt like losing my voice." The room fell quiet again as the children absorbed her words. Finally, Ava looked at Lila, her eyes kind but firm. "But I learned something that night," she continued. "They could take my hair, but they couldn't take my music. They couldn't take who I am. I still have my voice, and I'm going to use it to tell my story." From the doorway, Daniel exhaled quietly, pride swelling in his chest. She sounded so much like her mother in that moment, strong, unyielding, and full of grace. That evening, Ava sat at the piano in their modest living room, a candle flickering on the windowsill beside her. She stared at the keys, her reflection faintly visible in the polished surface. In the corner, Daniel worked at his desk, flipping through a stack of files. Every so often, he glanced up at her, watching as she prepared for the upcoming recital, a performance she wasn't sure she was ready for. "Thinking too hard again?" Daniel asked, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Ava didn't respond immediately. Her fingers ghosted over the keys, playing a soft, hesitant chord. "What if I mess up? What if they don't understand what I'm trying to say?" Daniel set down his pen and turned to face her. "Your music isn't for them to understand, sweetheart. It's for you to share. Some people will get it, some won't, but the ones who need to hear it the most, they'll feel it." Ava nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her like a blanket. "It still feels like too much sometimes." Daniel stood and walked over, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Then let it all out in the music. All the hurt, all the anger, all the strength, you've got it all inside you. Let them hear it." Ava looked up at him, her father's steady gaze giving her a sense of calm she hadn't felt since the night she lost her braids. She turned back to the piano, her fingers finding their place. The first notes she played were slow and soft, but they grew layer by layer into something deeper. She played for the humiliation of that night, for the part of her that had been cut away, for the quiet stares and whispered questions she endured every day. But she also played for the strength she'd found in herself, for the children who listened to her music and saw someone they could look up to. Her music filled the room like sunlight breaking through a storm, every note reflecting her unspoken promise. They wouldn't silence her, and they wouldn't break her spirit. The night of the recital arrived sooner than expected. Madison Concert Hall was packed, its golden lights casting a warm glow across the stage. Ava stood in the wings, clutching her sheet music and staring out at the sea of faces. Among them, she spotted Daniel sitting in the front row, his suit neatly pressed, his eyes already brimming with pride. Further back, nearly hidden in the shadows, sat Officer Ethan Price. He hadn't spoken to Ava since that night, but something had pulled him here, a need to bear witness to her strength. to face the consequences of his actions in the most profound way. The announcer called Ava's name, and she stepped onto the stage. The audience fell silent as she took her seat at the gleaming grand piano. Her hands hovered over the keys, her chest rising and falling as she took a deep breath. For a moment, she closed her eyes, shutting out the crowd, the lights, and the pressure. Then, she began to play. The opening notes were soft and hesitant, mirroring the rain that had fallen the night her life changed. As the piece built, so too did her strength. Each rise and fall carried the weight of her story, the loss, the struggle, and the resilience she had forged through it all. Ava didn't just play music that night, she gave the audience her truth. She let them feel her pain, her courage, and her unwavering determination to reclaim her voice. The melody swelled, filling every corner of the hall until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating with her energy. When the final note rang out, the hall was silent. Ava let her hands rest on the keys for just a moment longer before looking up. Then came the applause, thunderous, unrelenting, rising to a standing ovation that shook the room. In the shadows, Officer Price remained seated, tears gathering in his eyes. He understood now her music wasn't just beautiful. It was powerful. It was everything he had tried to take from her, given back tenfold. Ava rose and took her bow, her head held high, her short braids catching the light. She was no longer the girl defined by that night. She was something far greater. She was unbreakable. The precinct felt different now, quieter, colder. Ethan Price walked the familiar halls, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. But he no longer belonged. Officers he had once called friends glanced away as he passed, their gazes sharp with suspicion or worse, judgment. Some whispered in hushed tones. Others didn't bother to hide their disapproval. To them, Price was a man tainted, a traitor in their ranks. But Price didn't flinch. He had learned that transformation comes with a cost. In Captain Monroe's office, Price handed over his badge and gun, the weight of both objects heavy in his hands. Monroe accepted them without ceremony, his face unreadable. "Are you sure about this?" Monroe finally asked. His voice was gruff, but not unkind. Price met his gaze steadily. "It's time, Captain. I can't be part of this anymore, not until I'm the kind of man who deserves to wear this badge." Monroe sighed and leaned back in his chair. Most men wouldn't have the guts to walk away. Price, they'd hide behind the system, keep their heads down. "That's why I have to leave," Price replied. "I hid for too long. Now I'm ready to face it." Monroe nodded once. "Where will you go?" "Wherever I'm needed." Price left the precinct that day with his head high but his heart heavy. The old Ethan Price, arrogant, narrow-minded, unquestioning, was gone. What remained was a man stripped bare, searching for redemption not in words, but in action. In the weeks that followed, Price began to rebuild his life. He found himself at the Oakwood Community Center, the same place where he had once patrolled the streets with suspicion and prejudice. Now, he walked inside as a volunteer. The community center buzzed with energy. Kids played basketball, teens painted murals, and parents chatted in clusters. It was a place of hope, a world Price had never truly seen before. Miss Rodriguez, the center's director, greeted him at the door. "You're here again?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "I didn't think you'd stick around." "I'm just getting started," Price replied, smiling faintly. She led him to a group of teenagers sitting on mismatched chairs, their faces guarded. "Everyone, this is Mr. Price," Rodriguez said carefully. "He's here to listen." Price cleared his throat, his voice softer than usual. "Look, I'm not here to talk at you. I'm here because I want to understand what I got wrong, what the system got wrong." Jamal, the boy in the red hoodie who had once called him out, crossed his arms. "Why should we trust you? You're just another cop trying to feel good about himself." "I can't ask you to trust me," Price admitted. "Not yet. All I can do is show up and keep showing up." The room fell silent. Then, slowly, Jamal leaned forward. "Okay, let's see what you've got." Over time, Price proved himself. He helped teens prepare for job interviews, assisted with after-school programs, and even coached basketball, though he was terrible at it. He listened to their stories, the fears, the frustrations, and the dreams they carried. For the first time, he truly heard them. One day, Price was painting alongside Jamal, helping to restore a wall of the center. The mural, "Resilience Builds Bridges," shimmered in the sunlight. a vibrant tapestry of color and meaning. "You ever gonna go back to being a cop?" Jamal asked, wiping paint from his hands. "Maybe," Price answered honestly, "but not until I'm ready. Not until I can do the job the right way." Jamal nodded, seeming to accept that. "You're different now, you know." Price paused, his brush still against the wall. "I'm trying to be." In the meantime, Price found himself reconnecting with Ava Bennett. Their paths crossed once again when Miss Rodriguez invited Ava to play piano for the center's kids during an afternoon workshop. Ava arrived with her usual quiet grace, her short braids neatly styled and her fingers poised over the keys. She greeted Price with a nod, no hostility, but no forgiveness yet either. Her music filled the center, drawing children and teens to sit cross-legged on the floor. Mesmerized by the haunting, hopeful melody, Price lingered at the back of the room, watching. Ava's music spoke of pain and triumph, resilience and hope. When the final note faded, the room erupted into applause. As the children trickled out, Price approached her. "You're incredible," he said softly. Ava turned, her gaze steady but guarded. "Why are you still here, Officer Price?" He shook his head. "Just Price now. I'm here because I need to be." Ava studied him for a long moment. "People can change, but it takes more than showing up." "I know," Price replied, "but showing up is where I start." She didn't smile, but something in her expression softened. "Maybe it is." Months later, Price stood before a small group of officers at a community policing workshop. Invited by Daniel Bennett and the precinct's new leadership, he shared his story not to gain sympathy, but to shine a light on the harm caused by unchecked biases and misuse of authority. "I thought I was doing my job," Price said, his voice calm but unflinching. "But I let fear, ignorance, and power blind me to the truth. The harm I caused isn't something I can undo, but I can work every day to make it right." The room was silent as he finished, his words hanging heavy in the air. Some nodded in understanding, others avoided his gaze, still resistant to change. Price didn't mind. He wasn't speaking for their approval, he was speaking for the people he had once overlooked. That night, as Price sat alone in his small apartment, he pulled out a crumpled flyer from the bottom of his desk drawer. It was for Ava Bennett's resilience recital at the community center. He smoothed the paper with his fingers, reading the words that now carried so much weight. "Strength isn't found in perfection. It's found in the courage to begin again." Price smiled faintly, a quiet resolve settling over him. His transformation wasn't complete, it might never be, but he was walking a new path now. One step at a time. The next morning, he would show up again. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. The evening of Ava Bennett's resilience recital arrived with a quiet sense of gravity, as if the world itself recognized the importance of what was about to unfold. The Community Music Center, usually a modest building, now glowed warmly under soft lights. Inside, rows of chairs were filled with families, students, and teachers, each one holding a program that bore Ava's name in elegant script. Daniel Bennett sat in the front row, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the polished grand piano waiting on stage. He had watched his daughter fight through humiliation, heartbreak, and doubt to reclaim her voice, and tonight, the world would finally hear it. In a shadowed corner at the back of the hall, Ethan Price stood quietly, his presence hesitant but deliberate. He had promised himself he would witness Ava's moment of triumph, though he wasn't sure if he belonged there. He wore no uniform, no badge, just a man humbled by his mistakes, still searching for the right way to make amends. Backstage, Ava sat on a wooden bench, her hands resting gently on the keys of a small practice piano. The hum of the audience beyond the curtain drifted to her ears, rising and falling like a distant tide. Her short braids framed her face, each one a reminder of resilience, and her emerald green gown draped softly around her as if it, too, knew the importance of tonight. Her teacher, Mrs. Langston, leaned in close. "Remember what we talked about, Ava," she said softly. "You've earned this moment. Don't play to impress, play to tell your story." Ava nodded, taking a steadying breath. The memory of that painful night, the humiliation, the loss flashed through her mind, but it no longer brought her fear. Instead, it fueled her. Her music, forged in the fire of adversity, had become her strength, her voice, and her way of reclaiming what had been taken. The audience hushed as the lights dimmed and the curtain slowly rose. Ava walked onto the stage with quiet confidence, her emerald gown shimmering under the spotlight. The grand piano gleamed, waiting for her touch. The silence felt thick, almost tangible, as she adjusted her seat, her back straight and her head held high. She looked out at the audience and spotted her father's proud smile in the front row. A few rows back, she noticed familiar faces, friends, teachers, community members who had supported her through every step. And then, at the back of the hall, half hidden by the shadows, she saw Ethan Price. His presence was unexpected, but his eyes held no arrogance now, only humility and something else: regret. Ava's fingers hovered over the keys as she closed her eyes, blocking out everything but the music that had lived in her heart for months. Then, with her first touch of the piano, the room transformed. The piece began softly, almost like a whisper, with delicate notes that evoked the stillness of the night. She was stopped, the rain falling quietly, the hum of a patrol car, the tension in the air, each measure built with purpose, carrying the weight of her story. The low, mournful chords spoke of pain, of the moment her braids were cut, of dignity stripped away. But the music didn't linger in sorrow. It shifted, subtly at first. Melodies of determination swirled and pushed through the darkness. Ava's fingers danced across the keys, light but resolute, building the composition into something defiant and unbreakable. Her music declared what words could not: I am here. I am whole. I will not be silenced. The final movement soared, a triumphant crescendo that seemed to lift the entire room with it. It was not just a song but a declaration of resilience, of survival, and of hope. By the time the last note lingered and faded into the quiet, there was a beat of silence so profound it felt like a held breath. Then the audience erupted. The standing ovation rose like thunder, the applause echoing off the walls. Tears glistened on the faces of many who had been moved by her performance. Daniel stood first, his clapping strong, though his own tears betrayed the depth of his pride. Around him, others followed, rising to their feet in unison, their applause a tribute not just to Ava's talent but to her courage. Ava stood and bowed gracefully, her smile soft but radiant. As she straightened, her eyes drifted once more to the back of the room, where Ethan Price remained, standing quietly. Their gazes met for a moment, hers calm and unflinching, his full of quiet remorse. When the crowd began to filter out, Price stayed back, unsure if he should approach her. But Ava, with quiet purpose, stepped off the stage and walked toward him. The space between them felt heavy, filled with unspoken words. You came, she said simply, her voice steady. Price nodded, his throat tight. I had to see this for myself. You were. He hesitated, searching for the right words. Incredible. Ava studied him for a long moment. Why are you really here? Price exhaled deeply, his voice low and honest. Because I needed to hear what strength sounds like. And I needed to face you, to face what I did. Silence hung between them before Ava spoke again, her words clear and measured. You can't undo what happened. I know, Price replied quietly. But I'm trying to be better. Not for me, for the people I hurt. For the community I ignored. For you. Ava looked at him, and for the first time, her gaze softened. Change doesn't happen overnight, she said. It happens in what you choose to do every day. I know, Price said, nodding slowly. And I'll keep showing up. Ava didn't smile, but she gave him a small nod of acknowledgement before turning to walk back to her family. Price remained where he was, the weight of her words settling over him like a burden and a blessing. Outside, the night air was cool and still as Ava joined her father. Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his smile soft. You did it, sweetheart. I did, Ava replied, looking back at the music center. But this isn't the end. There's still more to do. Daniel smiled, recognizing the determination in her voice. Your mother would be so proud. Together, they walked toward their car, the echoes of Ava's music lingering in the air, a song of triumph, reconciliation, and the quiet power of resilience. Ethan Price watched from a distance, his steps slow as he turned to leave. The road to redemption stretched long before him, but he was walking it one step at a time. Tonight, Ava Bennett had played her heart out, and in doing so, she had reminded them all. Strength isn't found in perfection, it's found in rising. Again and again.